Celal holds forth and has held forth since 1976, if not before. So with no further ado, introduce Celal Şengör.
Thank you, David. After having been embarrassed to the ground, I don't know how I will talk. I'm sure I will disappoint you after this flashing introduction. See, David has belonged to a very small population of people who suffered me, at least for the last, 33 years, David? We were students together, and I have been, for many things, been grateful to him. And he has conned the faculty of this great university into giving me an honorary degree. I was asked to whether I would give a talk as a part of this ceremonies, and I must confess to you, I love to listen to myself, so I immediately volunteered. I said, but they said it has to be for a general audience, so I said, okay, I will not talk about geology as such, but I'll talk about how history of science, a knowledge of history of science, helps a practicing scientist, and why. And that's why I titled this talk, Science, History of Science, and the Muse of Discovery. Where does the muse come from? Now, when we talk about science, you have to define it first. It's a way of acquiring knowledge about objects and processes, both external and internal, to reasoning beings, that functions by generating testable hypotheses concerning the objects or processes of interest, and then testing them by observation statements. Now, you may know that this definition of science was first formally proposed by Sir Karl Raimund Popper in 1933 and elaborated in 1934, and has since been widely recognized by many scientists as the best definition of science. This is the original version of his book, Logik der Forschung, which has been translated into English in 1959 as The Logic of Scientific Discovery. Popper, in here, propounded this definition of science, and he emphasized that it doesn't matter how you conceive hypotheses, but it matters they be testable, and that they be testable by observation statements. That is the most important thing. So in his first popular collection of essays, Albert Einstein was an acquaintance of Popper's, and he very much liked Popper's definition. Einstein pointed out that to pursue science, we need two things. You need certain general conditions that are called principles, and from these principles you make deductions, and these deductions are tested. So our task is divided into two. First, to find the principles, and two, to test those principles. Einstein pointed out that at schools and universities, we learn the business of testing very well. We learn how to observe things, we learn how to make experiments, blah, blah, blah, blah. It's excellent. But to find the principles, Einstein pointed out, there is absolutely no method that is teachable. That means that in order to conceive hypotheses or even to recognize problems, unfortunately, we can't teach you about that. And you're entirely dependent on your brains and other circumstances that can't be any further defined. So, where do we find the muse of discovery? Notice the peers. There is, I think, a naval captain talking to Einstein. In libraries, that's my preferred place to sit in. You can go on expeditions. This is in Caltech. This is the farthest Albert went on an expedition. And you can be frivolous. David and I studied in an institution where being frivolous helped in generating hypotheses. So, another way of asking the same question is, what is the origin of hypotheses? And remember, this was the thing that Einstein said, don't know. Now, Grove Karl Gilbert, many people said that James Dwight Dana was probably the greatest geologist that the United States produced. I disagree. It was Grove Karl Gilbert. I mean, I would ask the entire audience here to gently rise and stand 1 minute in silence in his presence. This was an amazing man, really an amazing man. And Gilbert was president of the Washington Geological Society, and then he was, when he was asked to give his presidential address, he chose the title, The Origin of Hypotheses. And Gilbert said, the way we generate hypotheses is to use analogies. Now, I underline, he didn't say homologies. He didn't necessarily say that we use things that have similar functions. Simply similar things, simply things that trigger things in our minds. And he used the meteorite impact crater in Arizona as an example, and he came to the wrong conclusion. But never mind. So in my experience, history of geology helped me find cases analogous to those under my consideration at any given time, or to find hints to that suggested analogies. So by studying the solutions, you're led to hypotheses. I said discovery here. This is extremely arrogant and preposterous, but you know, this was chosen for a very exalted occasion. So it really means that they led me to lies that I can fool my colleagues for sometimes, and in the process, advance the science. So you cannot do the same always by consulting the present literature, because the present literature is conceived, written in the same framework in which you're working. But you want to step outside that framework to be able to generate really dashing hypotheses. So I will give you two examples. I wrote a paper in 1976, and this is the memorable date that David told you about. It's collision of irregular continental margins, implications for foreland deformation of alpine-type origins. And then when I became a student at Albany, this is 2 years after I became a student, an enlarged version was written by Kevin Burke and John Dewey and myself. This simply said that when you have continental collision, one continent banging into another one, it cracks the other continent and creates a rift valley. Now, I was led to that problem through two things. I went to a meeting in Germany in 1975 with the structural geology professor Carl Norman in Houston. He was sent along with me that he might get some enthusiasm out of this business. Literally, I mean, that's what John Butler said, take Carl with you. He said, we want him to get more active, he said. And I said, I'll do it with great pleasure. And in that meeting, the Rheingraben was presented as a result of mantle updoming. You know, you dome the continent like a tart or whatever, you know, as a cake, and the top fractures. But the Rheingraben is rather too regular for that. It goes north-south. And the late Professor Ilias presented it. I didn't like it. And I remembered that I had read this paper, Zum Problem der Grabenbildung by Maximilian Weber. Maximilian Weber pointed out in a series of papers in 1921 that rifts form at high angles to mountain belts and are similar in origin to the AC joints of faults. An AC joint is very simple. If you make a fold like that, you make cracks in here because something that you shorten in that direction get extended in this direction. Simple. And that's what Max Weber thought. And great authorities like Hans Cloos said this was nonsense. Didn't like it. Cloos thought that rifts form by uplift. But look at the figure Cloos drew in his own textbook. See, I remembered that figure because this is a 1936 book. Now, when I was a little student, I only had a reprint of it done in 1964. This was a very influential textbook. It survived the plate tectonics revolution. In the 70s, it was being used. And justifiably so, it was a very good textbook. But look what Cloos did. Here's a mountain belt, 90 degrees to it is a rift. Now, if he thought Weber was full of it, why did he do it that way? So, observationally, Cloos knew somehow, even perhaps before Weber said it, that rifts form at 90 degrees to the mountain belts. And little Celal, in 1976, I said, look at this. Now, funny it is, because today, the Rheingraben, and this is the Pfalzlinie, and this is the Elbe-Linie, and this is the lower Rheingraben, these things today sit with respect to the Alpine belt in a shear orientation. However, if the initial collision was here with the Briançonnet continent, I thought that a collision like that could create a crack, just like this. And we know from around the Rheingraben there are dikes that have come in, just a little bit older than Rheingraben, that extended it. But, I mean, never mind the story. The inspiration was Weber's papers. Had I not read them, I don't know whether I would have been able to come up with the solution. And this became very popular, and Kevin Burke invented the word impactogen for these things. It was having read Weber, the memory of Weber's paper in my mind triggered it, and I said, fine. Well, I mean, this is a fairly innocent example. Now, there's a more profound example. When I got interested in Central Asia, see, Central Asia is an amazing place. It is full of mountain belts, full of old mountain belts, and nobody had been able to draw boundaries between them. It is a mountain belt that looks not so much like an elegant lady. Most mountain belts are thin and long, like elegant ladies. You know, they look like Janet. Whereas this mountain belt in Central Asia looked like me. It was round, and it looked nothing like a mountain belt. So it had been a problem, and the poor Russians had come up with most incredible hypotheses about them. And one of them was called, what was that called, David? The mosaic model of geosync That was totally rubbish. You know, they were naming things that you don't understand. So when I got interested in this, and these are the papers that resulted, initial papers that resulted from that interest, and I got interested in that, I said, okay, I will look at the old literature. What the area we're talking about is, now this is the Caspian Sea. There's the Arctic Ocean. This is the Scandinavian Peninsula. And here's Japan, Kamchatka. And Lake Baikal is here. This is Lake Balkhash, and Aral Sea used to be here, but it's gone now. This is the Altaids, these Central Asian mountain ranges. And as you can see, I mean, a normal mountain range looks like that, or looks like this, the Alps and Himalayas. They don't look like this. So you said, why does it look like that? It's very, very strange. And when I started reading the literature, I said, okay, I'll look at the older literature first. Baron Alexander von Humboldt, in 1829, paid a visit to there because of the invitation of Baron Cancrin, who was the Minister of Finance. Now, you might be curious about knowing why a Minister of Finance is interested in having geological expeditions. You know, happy were those days. But Baron Cancrin was trying to get Humboldt to tell him whether platinum could be used as a basis for Russian money. So they invited Humboldt. Humboldt said he would like to see these Central Asian mountains. But look at what he says. He says in his account of the Russian Altai, Humboldt repeatedly emphasizes the extreme paucity of gneisses. Gneisses are these very highly metamorphic rocks, very coarse-grained. They form from deforming things like granite or really cooking sediments at very high temperatures. And, you know, they are good continental basement. Humboldt said, we don't see enough of them. Now, in those days, gneisses made the axes of mountain ranges. And all mountain ranges had very nice axes of gneisses. And Humboldt was shocked that in Central Asia they didn't exist. He only saw slates, but also various kinds of schists. And he said, well, there is also granite among these schists and slates, but no gneisses. And this is his map. I mean, this map really doesn't say anything, except to say that he says, we see these mountains getting younger southwards. That's what he said. But then comes this very great man. Now, Edward Suess was an amazing man. I mean, this man was the greatest geologist who ever lived. Every time I get elected to some place or I get an award, I look at the previous recipients. He is invariably there. He was an amazing guy. Okay, this is a quote from his famous book, The Face of the Earth, Das Antlitz der Erde, where the third volume, first part, describes Asia. Now look what he says. He says, we may first observe that in these great mountains, as well as in the whole western part of the Altai, beyond the Irtish, not a single band of gneiss of any importance is known to exist. Indeed, this rock is seldom met with at all in these mountains, and never, except as a strictly local occurrence, a remarkable contrast to what is found in other lofty folded ranges. On the other hand, we meet with schistose rocks in surprising abundance. Mica schist, chlorite schist, clay slate, the last named with beds of limestone. and towards its summit, Devonian or lower Carboniferous fossils which are found at many localities. These schists, like those in the Salair and Alatau, are pierced by granite, syenite and porphyry, and diorite in dikes and bosses. In the contact zones lie many of the famous ore bodies of the Altai. Now, granite is an igneous rock that comes in at where oceans go under continents or where continents collide. Now, ignore cyanite, because in those days cyanite was used a funny way. So essentially it's saying the same thing. Porphyry, you know, these are mainly andesites. These are found, again, today, subduction zones. Now, diorites, these are a little bit deeper versions of andesites. And he says, he points out in the contact zones lie many of the famous ore bodies of the Altai, you know, like Sierra Nevada. Now, when you read that, you realize he says the same thing about Central Asia as did Humboldt. That's the title page of the first volume of ANTİK. And this is his map. And again here, Zeus drew the trend lines of these mountain ranges, and his message was, from here in that direction, from that in that direction, everything got younger. Now, this is a cross-section he drew in 1914. This goes from center of, just north of Lake Baikal, all the way to the four deeps in the Pacific. And you can see he has indicated the Pacific going under the continent. Now, this insight, ladies and gentlemen, had been lost for at least 60 years. And people such as Hans Stille in Germany, Leopold Kober in Austria, Walter Booker in this country had been responsible. And every time I mentioned their names, William Spencer Francis Kidd, who was a teacher of both David's and mine, he used to say they should have strangled at birth. You know? But look at this. Particularly concentrate on that. And this is what Professor Taira drew in 1992. He drew a lot of vertical structures in here. And look, this is Pacific going under Japan. This is a cross-section across Japan, by the way. This is undergoing Japan. And you would think that this is very similar to that. But now the Japanese have shot seismic sections across this. Deep seismic sections. Again, look at that. Look at that. Zeus was more right than Taira in 1992. Now you would wonder why that is so. Was that a lucky guess? Now we know that it wasn't. I mean, Zeus's method of dealing with the information, processing the literature was unbelievable. He was sitting in Vienna. He hadn't seen any of these places. He was just doing it by literature and by correspondence. The important thing is that he has looked at these areas, he saw these structures, and these are the accretionary wedges in Oregon that David and I had been raised on. I mean, when we were students, you learned about these things. But you also learned this is the only environment in the world where you're going to make a lot of schists, and you're going to make a lot of slates. And behind these things will be the granites, etc. And when these things grow forward as a result of the subduction of the ocean, the granites will invade these things. Now, this is, again, from Japan. We look at what what's called subduction accretion complexes contain. They have pillar lavas, they have cherts, they have varicolored shales, and finally, shales and limestones that come on top of that. And when I reread Zeus, I was struck by the fact that there was no regular variation of rock types across the strike in the Altaids in Central Asia. In fact, there was a monotony of the ubiquitous triplet: basalt, chert, turbidite, in vast areas, invaded by this tonalitic, granodioritic, granitic plutons. Plutons these are intrusions characteristic of what we call subduction zones, where oceans undergo, rather, underthrust continents. And, oh, I did something stupid, sorry. Would you please go away? Oh, thank you. Well, that was a clever suggestion. Click anywhere. That's the kind of thing I like. Now, Zeus described these rocks in structures, and he said, sea of more or less denuded folds. He'd never seen them. You're looking at a satellite image, and these are the denuded folds. Look at that. This isn't the gobby. Look at it. There's a nice fold. Here's a nice fold. He had seen these things in his mind's eye. And when he looked at the Kwenlun, which is outside the mountain range that I'm talking about, this is northern Tibet, but he studied the reports of von Lotzi, who had gone with Count Szechenyi into this area as a part of the Austrian expedition. And all of these ranges are thrust-bounded subduction accretion complexes today. And Zeus said they looked very much like Central Asia. Now, this is a portion of a map that my colleague of mine and myself, we've generated, and please look at it. All the colors other than red, and other than these buff colors, they are products of what we today call subduction accretion complexes. The red are these granites, when Humboldt said, that are found in the schistose region. And when we looked at this, we said, this is many subduction accretion complexes that have come together. There's no other way to explain this. So we said all the explanations so far put forward was nonsense. They were trying to do something out of this mountain range that it couldn't do. So we said, look, along these lines, some of them still active today, there had to be big faults that would bring portions of them next to one another. And if you add many Janets next to one another, you will generate a belly like mine. You see, it will be enlarged. That's what's happened in Central Asia. The islands and the reefs become less numerous as distance from the peninsula. Now we're in Southeast Asia because we asked ourselves, in this mess of granite, how are we going to find the individual arc systems? Zeus again points the way. He says, the islands and the reefs become less numerous as the distance from the peninsula increases as you go away from the Malay Peninsula, until at last it becomes impossible to discover the trend lines by which they are governed. But this does not always hold true for the volcanoes. Very often we find that as a cordillera becomes concealed beneath the sea, volcanoes increase in number. And it may happen that the cordillera completely disappears while curves of volcanoes remain visible and reveal the plan of the vanished structure. And he repeats again, he says, the farther out the trend lines advance into the ocean, the more distinctly they are indicated by volcanoes. And he provided a figure for us. Now look at this. You see, when you're on land, when you're on Sumatra, islands, or Borneo, no problem, you can follow the structures. But as you go out into the ocean, look, here, out in the Banda Arc, all you have is volcanoes, especially in those days. So he said, I can follow the trend lines of the mountain range by tracing out the volcanoes. Now, what happens when you erode the volcanoes? You go to the roots of the volcanoes, you see these granites. So we said, these arcs, we know they are no wider than 40 kilometers today. And we know that their fronts are very sharp. So we mapped them out on more schematized basement structures in here. And it turned out that every one of these fragments had its own arc on it, as indicated here. Because the figure, the symbol we chose for them was rather idiotic. I apologize for that. You can hardly see them. But there they are. I can trace them out for you. For example, there's one arc. Okay. There's another one. It goes along like that. You see? There's another one. But these are arcs that have been mangled, that have been cut, offset, displaced, and reassembled during the approach of two large plates. Okay? And out of this mess, you come to this more manageable mess. But then this mess, because now you know the arcs, you can pull them apart. You can take the arcs apart, and then you realize you have a single arc. Huge arc like that we see along Eastern Asia today. Now, this was fantastic. And when we proposed this model, many of our Russian friends wanted to know how we thought of this model. And I said, read this. They thought I was joking. I said, no. I said, read it. What's this? This is pre-plate tectonics, but it's going to lead you to the right place. Now, another thing, this is not my discovery, but this is a remarkable thing. I mean, that's, you know, history of science helps you in a very funny way in here. This animal has just been found. It's been reported in Chinese Science Bulletin 2009 September. There was in Nature a little report about that again, because they found another fossil of this. Now, this is Anchiornis huxleyi. This is a dinosaur about that big. That big. And you can see that it's a tetrapteryx. That means it has 4 wings. It has wings on the arms, it has wings on the feet. And these wings are not imaginations of Shu and company. These are on the slab. You see them fossilized. Now, the interesting thing about that is that in 1927, an extremely unhappy and unfortunate paleontologist called Gerhard Heilmann, this unfortunate man, for some strange reason, had to live in Denmark. Now you realize the oldest deposits in Denmark barely go beyond Paleocene. That means, you know, they barely cross the boundary 65 million years, and most of it is quaternary. Most of it is about 2 million years old. And Gerhard Heilmann was a man who was interested in deposits that are 140, 150 million years old. None of that in Denmark. Not only that, of course, because these things didn't exist in Denmark, there are no veteran paleontologists in Denmark, and Gerhard Heilmann bitterly complains in the introduction of his book. He says, I'm so alone here, there is nobody to talk to. Poor man. But he published a book called On the Origin of Birds. In 1927, he said, it's very clear that these animals birds came out of reptiles. And he said, my God, they look like dinosaurs. But he looked at Archaeopteryx and he said, this animal is really too much of a bird to have hopped directly from dinosaurs or from any other reptile. He said, no, there had to be intermediary forms. So he studied the wing structure of Archaeopteryx and he said, what did Archaeopteryx do with these wings? Archaeopteryx had claws on the wings. And Heilmann said, this animal obviously wanted to climb trees, because that's one way you escape from your enemies, and the other way, you can see your prey, and you can glide from tree to tree, and while you're gliding, you can find your food. And if you happen to be on the ground, your wings give you a lot more area to catch succulent insects, and you can put them into your mouth. Yeah. So he said, well, if this was the function of these wings, let us imagine an animal that would be somewhere intermediary. And he called it Proavis, and he was bold enough, fortunately, to sketch his animal. Now, Beebe, in 1915, already suspected that the birds had a tetrapteryx stage. That means a 4-winged stage beforehand. And he drew an animal, but that was not very carefully thought out. Whereas this animal, Heilmann's animal, was built using stepwise evolutionary arguments. And the beautiful thing about that is, that animal is found in the year 2009. A prediction based on Darwinian model. This is as good a prediction any bloody physicist can make. You know, the physicists think they smell differently under the armpits. They don't. You know, I mean, we geologists are as good scientists as they are, and biologists. We can make predictions like that. I dare any physicist to make as complicated a prediction. And look at that. This animal jumped out of the rock. It existed. Now, knowing Heilmann's great success in 1927 gives an immense confidence to you in your methods. And I can tell you, when I heard the discovery of Anchionis Huxley, I couldn't sleep all night. I mean, I was so excited, like a little child, you know, who's given a new toy. You know, I kept looking at it, and I remember when the first feathered dinosaur was found. It was 2000, and I had just been elected, remember, you were there, to the National Academy, to Washington. I went there to sign the book, and the Rowleys most kindly were there to sort of clap for me. My wife came, my father came, my son came. I promptly abandoned all of them. I signed the book and I said, goodbye. I said, I have to go. They said, where are you going? I said, I have to go to New York, to the American Museum of Natural History. Because I said, the feathered dinosaur is there. It's on loan. I have to see it. I sat in front of that fossil 2 hours. And visitors thought I was a man of the museum. So they asked me questions, which I duly answered. But, I mean, I beg you to look at this. How would you not feel that immense confidence that even poor Darwin was lacking until he was dragged screaming and kicking by Wallace's letter? The history of science, Goethe said once, is science itself. See, science cannot be done without also doing its history. And history of science cannot be done without also doing science, because of the simple reason that both go after the problems that interest science. Without the problems of science, there can be neither science nor its history. Science is not an accumulation of facts. History of science is not an accumulation of facts about scientists, or about facts of science about social circumstances that may connect the two. You know, in both philosophy and history of science, it has become very fashionable to talk about the social circumstances that create the environment of the scientists and their thinking, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I would be too arrogant if I said this, but I can't stop myself. I will say it. You know, it's bullshit. I mean, you know, I wrote a paper once just to show this. The mélange concept in geology, never mind what it is, it has been independently discovered 5 times. Once in Scotland, once in Turkey by a Turk working in impossible conditions during the war, then by a Chinaman working in California, and we know that there were 2 episodes earlier that nobody talks about by the Swiss in the Alps, all independent of each other. They all came to the same conclusions. And you ask these so-called social scientists, you say, look, this Chinaman, Ken Shu, was raised in breeding Yangtze. His social environment had absolutely nothing to do with our social environment, right? And he thought exactly the same things as did Greenlee, who was a very stout and religious Scotsman, and the same thing as this poor Turkish graduate student whose world was worlds apart from either the Scotsman or the Chinaman. They thought exactly the same things, came exactly to the same conclusions, because they were looking exactly the same phenomenon. So it is hypotheses that drive you, but what eventually links the hypothesis into what we hope to be the reality, it is the tests with observation. And that's what distinguishes us. Okay? Both history and history of science are about problems that science goes after in historical continuity. Now, this is where I was going to end my lecture. And, in fact, I told David I was going to end it there, but now I got so excited I'm not. So, I would like to present this to you. I said, we the scientists are the only people who try to create images of something that already exists. And therefore, by definition, it is perfect. Right? Everyone else, artists, businessmen, farmers, soldiers, clerks, the clergy, they must find out whether their creations are perfect because they don't correspond with any reality. It's their creations. But they can never do it, even if they think they achieved everything they initially aimed for they lack an external absolute standard. Now, our absolute standard is the existing world. I mean, it's perfect because our aim is to describe it. You know, whether you can like it or not, it is there, right? So, pursuit of science is therefore the most sublime and satisfying of all human endeavors. And I apologize to the rest of the world, but ultimately it's the only one that counts anyway. Right? I mean, I have many people around me in Turkey, among our politicians, and these beautiful religious nuts. When their head hurts, they swallow an aspirin. Hail Bayer. Right? And IG Farben probably behind that. I don't know the history of aspirin, but it was a German chemist who did it. So what makes our life possible, what will make life in the future possible, bearable, and perhaps even happy, is science only. All the rest is fine. I mean, you know, it's very important to have art, for example, because that fosters creativity. Great. Some people think religion is necessary. I don't. I think it is evil from head to tail. But, you know, they might have it. But the important thing is if you don't have science, you will not have the luxury of having anything else. And that's why looking at the history of science is very important. It reinforces us in this view of the world. And I am very much afraid we're getting away from that view. We are not communicating with the public. And another advantage the history of science has, that non-scientists can read it. They even can get excited about it. And that is why I would recommend history of science to everybody, but in particular to practicing scientists also, as both a source of inspiration and a source of fun. Thank you. Please, ma'am.
So how do you pursue the pursuit of science and get it back into action?
Well, as I said, it lies largely... how do you pursue science to be able to pursue science and get into action? The way to do it goes through education. We have to fix our educational institutions. I was invited about 6 months ago to a meeting in Turkey about energy. And my task was to tell people what the energy potential of the Mediterranean was and how it could be protected. Now, you might have perhaps guessed that this was a military symposium. And I was invited in my capacity as a geologist and as a former Air Force man. And at the end of that, as one of the measures, I said, look, we really have to educate people if we want to use energy sensibly. We have to educate people in the natural sciences. And the natural science education is far too important to be left in the hands of local politicians. When I say local politicians, I mean the national ones, you know, like the ones in Turkey, in Italy, in Germany, in the United States. I said, the education of science has to be monitored by international academies, by scientists. You can't allow politicians to get their hands on it. I mean, I know it goes completely contrary to the time-honored traditions of democracy in this country, but too bad. Science is too important to be left to people who know nothing about it, because it can be very destructive too, as those of us who lived through World War II remember. Please.
Do you still think Popper's notion of falsifiability is central to science is applicable throughout science today? Sometimes it seems like some of the things that we do in observational sciences push the edge of what's really falsifiable. And so has your subsequent thinking changed?
The question was whether Popper's notion of falsifiability is still applicable to science, because certain things in observational science seems to be pushing the boundaries of that to areas where perhaps we can't test them. The answer is I am as adamant about Popper's falsifiability, as I was the first day, because in observational scientists, you're one, we are one, what we do is we make observations in the light of questions, in the light of previous hypotheses. Without those previous hypotheses, we cannot even formulate those questions. Now, in science, we may sometimes formulate things, heuristic things, that may not be immediately testable. We should be aware of them, and we should say, look, these are there to argue about with the hope of generating hypotheses that can be testable. But they are only heuristic means, or means of discussion, if you like. And unfortunately, Popper, for example, thought Darwinism was one of those things, because he thought it was not testable. And I just wrote to the editor of Nature that I said we should discuss the discovery Anchiornis huxleyi, because that really shows that evolution was perfectly testable. And those of you paleontologists, if there are any paleontologists among us here, will remember that Henry Fairfield Osborn, the great paleontologist, American Museum of Natural History, wrote a book in 1910 called The Age of Mammals. It has one of the most philosophical introductions to paleontology. And he talks about, before Popper, he talks about testability of paleontology. So I think, yes, we are still at every step Popperian. Regrettably, however, even in this university, I think, there are philosophers and historians of science who don't do science themselves who think that Popper is passé. He's not. And I was talking to Bob Richards the other night in David's presence. Bob is a good friend of mine, so I teased him and I said, Bob, I said, this university has ruined its record by giving an honorary degree to that idiot Thomas Kuhn. And I said, David got very alarmed, so he said, to set the record back, I said, he proposed me. And Bob said, I was one of the proposers for Thomas Kuhn. I said, I know, you told me that. Any other questions? I'm not going to be that harsh again. Yes, please.
I took an intro to history of science classes. I took an introduction to the history of science class here at the university. One of the things that was told to me in this class, which was run out of the history of science department, it's a subdivision of the history department, was that you can't trust scientists to talk about their own practice, because being in the field, they're not able to get the correct perspective on things.
The question, I think you want me to comment on that?
Yes,
right. The gentleman said that he'd taken a history of science course from the history of science department in this university, and he was told that the scientists could not be trusted by looking at their own history because they would not have a perspective on what they're doing. Now, this is like saying that a cook cannot be trusted about what he's doing. And you have to have somebody coming from the outside who neither tasted the food nor cooked the food to talk about the process of cooking. Doesn't work. Now, this is a very widespread, and it's becoming more widespread now, to the point where the Edinburgh School says that you don't even have to know anything about that science to be able to evaluate the scientists in that field as a historian. Now, that, in my experience, amounts to rubbish. In fact, I have been interested in history of science, David remembers, since my student days. I very, very rarely read historians of science. Very rarely. And when I read them, I have to be very careful about what I'm saying, but I have really never felt any illumination in terms of ideas. I learned facts. I mean, they dig up facts, and mostly, letters and things like that, people who talk to who and that sort of thing. But in terms of ideas, I've always learned from scientists writing about history of science that they were by far the best accounts. So I recommend to you, you do exactly the opposite of what is told you by your teachers in history of science.
That's the Chicago way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This university thrives on that, as your president said.
One reason I keep coming back to Popper is because evolution is a very interesting example. There's a parallel talk going on at roughly the same time, the death of intelligence.
Yeah.
And actually, the court case, Kitzmiller versus Dover, which centered on the issue is, how do we tell that evolution is a science and intelligent design isn't? Tried to apply various notions, and the court judge, could not actually conclude on the basis of Popper that intelligent design was sort of less falsifiable than evolution, but nonetheless concluded correctly that evolution is science and intelligent design isn't, based on other notions about practice of science, including how one generates hypotheses and so forth. So the practice of trying to decide objectively whether something is falsifiable or not, it's somehow not entirely.
I would disagree, if I may. Have you finished your question before I say anything? Yeah. The question was whether, in practice, Popper's falsifiability criterion can be applied, because in an intelligent design court case, the judge was unable to decide on Popper's criterion whether evolution was science or whether intelligent design was not science. Now, of course, it says the case indicates that the judge was not very intelligent, or not. Well, I think not very intelligent is enough. He didn't have to know anything about it. He didn't even have to know about Popper, because intelligent design says whatever you see, some higher intelligence must have designed it. There is no escaping from that. There is no way you can find a case where people could say, but that was not it. Whereas in evolution, it is very easy. If somebody says flight had a tetrapteryx phase, if you find a smooth transition, had we found a smooth transition from Compsognathus longipes, which is a dinosaur that goes like that, to two-winged flight of Archaeopteryx, and had it had these intermediate forms, we would have said Beebe and Gerhard Heilmann had been clearly wrong in their thinking that a tetrapteryx stage was necessary. Now, their hypothesis has been corroborated, but not proven. That was very important about Popper's point. Now, you can find a parallel line of evolution that led to bi-wing flight directly from the dinosaurs, but for the time being, what we have found is an agreement with a hypothesis that existed before any of this evidence had come through. But also, that hypothesis was in principle falsifiable. And as I said, had these two things not come through, would have been falsified. You remember when Popper says, when he was 19 in Vienna, there were 4 hypotheses, he said, very popular. One was Marx's historical materialism. The other one was Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. The third one was Friedrich Adler's inferiority complexes. And the fourth one, rather, was Einstein's relativity. Popper says no Marxist could ever open a newspaper without finding some absolute confirmation of Marx's theory. Nothing could prove Marx wrong. So what Marx said explained absolutely everything. And Popper said, from that he deduced that Marx explained nothing. In terms of psychoanalysis, once you lie down on the couch of Freud, there was no case that he could not reduce to your sexual impulses as a child. Right? So that goes out of the window. And with Friedrich Adler, Popper says he had himself a very interesting experience. He took a child to Professor Adler, and Popper said, just as the child was walking through the door, Adler says, I know what's wrong with him. Popper was much taken aback. He said, Herr Professor, how? Ah, he said, my 1,000-fold experience. And Popper said, no, with this it's 1,001-fold, I suppose now. He said. But he said Einstein was not like that. Einstein said, if the light doesn't bend, I'm done with. Throw my theory into the wastebasket. Finished. And when Eddington stepped on the Thames, you know, this army of reporters met him, and Eddington said, the fabric of the universe was different from what we had thought previously. Newton falsified on the spot. Albert was right. And when Elsa Einstein, the next day, rises from her bed, goes and looks at the street, and wakes up Albert, says, Albert, don't go out today. And Albert says, why? There is no place in the street, she says. Whole of Berlin was there. And can you imagine, with this enthusiasm, Albert says, but my theory cannot be true. Because he says, we cannot put all the forces together. There is something else that we have to wait for. Now that is science. And that's why intelligent design is idiocy. It is pure human stupidity. That it's like Marxism. You can explain anything, anything, anything and everything can be ascribed to a non-existent God. I mean, you know, the best description of this feeling was what Dawkins found, God delusion. And living in an uncivilized country, I can tell you it's the most dangerous idea ever invented by mankind. And it's got to be eradicated. Now David will escort me in police custody out.
I'd like to have us thank Celal one more time for...
Thank you. Thank you.